Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Civic Life Lunch, Big Brother 2.0, Privacy in the Social Media Age. My name is Pavel Nabotovsky, and I'm a grad student in cybersecurity and public policy with a focus on technology for development. We're grateful for the support of our co-sponsors today, the Fletcher School and the School of Engineering, Cybersecurity, and Public Policy program at Fletcher. Tisch College has many events and civic leaders visiting campus virtually and in person this spring. Tomorrow evening at 5:30 p.m., we'll be virtually welcoming Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley to discuss what it means to build a multiracial democracy. You can find more information and register for this and all of our other opportunities by visiting tischcollege.tufts.edu/events. For folks in the Zoom room today, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions during the event. You can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions at any time. Tisch staff will do their best to get to as many of them as possible. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Sarus Farivar. Sarus is currently a senior writer at Forbes, covering, among other topics, surveillance technology and artificial intelligence, and now the unfortunately famous crypto couple. Prior to this role, he was an investigative tech reporter at NBC News, and in 2021, he and four of his colleagues won a James Madison Freedom of Information Award from the Society of Professional Journalists, Northern California chapter, for their reporting on Amazon warehouse workers' grassroots effort to track the spread of COVID at their job sites. Sarus is the author of multiple books, including Habeas Data, looking at legal cases that have shaped surveillance law in America, and The Internet of Elsewhere, contrasting the experience and impact of the internet on four very different countries. He has also reported for Ars Technica, the Canadian Broadcast Corporation, National Public Radio, The Economist, Wired, The New York Times, Slate, and many others. He received his BA in Political Economy from UC Berkeley and his MS from the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Moderating today's conversation will be Associate Professor of Cybersecurity Policy at the Fletcher School, Josephine Wolfe. Her book, You'll See This Message When It's Too Late, The Legal and Economic Aftermath of Cybersecurity Breaches, was published by MIT Press in 2018, and her second book, Cyber Insurance Policy, Rethinking Risk in the Age of Ransomware, Computer Fraud, Data Breaches, and Cyber Attacks, will come out later this year. Her writing on cybersecurity has also appeared in Slate, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and Wired. Prior to joining Fletcher, she was an assistant professor of public policy at the Rochester Institute of Technology and a fellow at the New America Cybersecurity Initiative and Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. She received a PhD in engineering systems and an MS in technology and policy from MIT and an AB in mathematics from Princeton. Now, everyone, please hit your virtual applause reaction for Sarus Farivar and Josephine Wolfe.
Thank you so much, Pavel. And thank you, Sarus, for being here. I have been reading your work for as long as I can remember being interested in digital privacy and security. So it is such a thrill to have you here. And thank you for joining us today. I want to start by sort of asking a question that I'm always interested in, especially for people who work in this space who don't come from really technical backgrounds, which is, how did you kind of start thinking about digital privacy and surveillance and technology? How did you get interested in this beat? What started you on this path?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I feel like a lot of my journalism, for me, I always feel like starts out by asking what I feel like are dumb questions. Just asking like very simple questions like, why does this thing exist? Or how did this thing come to be? Or, like, why is this legal? Or, things like that. So with regard to privacy and surveillance, I think for me, it really started, or it really, I would say, intensified a little over a decade ago when I was living in Germany. I had just moved from California, which is where I live now. I live in Oakland, California. And I had moved to Germany to take a job at Deutsche Welle English, which is the international broadcaster for Germany. It's sort of equivalent to the BBC World Service. And I had never lived in Germany before. I didn't speak German at all. I didn't know anybody. I didn't know anything. But what I did know, I had been a tech reporter for a few years, and I did know this is 2010, and Google Street View had just arrived in Germany, just as I was arriving in Germany. This is like the spring of 2010, and Germans, I found out, love privacy, one, and two, we're kind of skeptical, to put it mildly. We're very kind of, not super thrilled with Google Street View. The idea, and if you think about it, right, like Google Street View at its concept, at its core, is very weird, right? Like the idea of a private company rolling around every street, literally every street, and taking pictures of everything, cars, people, dogs, cats, bikes, houses, everything, is weird, right? And you can imagine how we as Americans might feel if a German company or a Chinese company or a foreign company started doing that here, right? Like when Google did this in the aughts, I want to say, I think there was some like privacy sort of pushback a little bit from folks in the privacy community, but we all just sort of live with it now. We all just sort of take it for granted that like there are pictures of every street in America on the internet forever, and that they get updated maybe once, twice a year. And we're just kind of fine with that generally. But in Germany, they were less fine with it. So there was a lot of blowback. And I was trying to understand kind of why was the German reaction so different? This was being talked about in the highest levels of German government, in German media for weeks and weeks and weeks. And to make a long story short, basically, Google decided to stop updating Google Street imagery in Germany. And as far as I know, they've not yet restarted it. So if you go and look on Google Street View, and they were only doing it in a few cities, they weren't doing it all over the country. If you go look in Berlin and Munich and some other cities, you'll see that the images are from like many years ago. Whereas in Oakland, in Boston, in lots of other places, I'm pretty sure they're updated once or twice a year usually. So I found that very interesting, and I started to talk to people about people's kind of thoughts about privacy, culture around privacy. The German government has this idea, and Europe in general has this idea of data protection. Germany has a data protection agency, and in fact, each state has a data protection authority. And this was something that I encountered as a reporter a lot, is like some, usually the German data protection authority in like Bavaria or something, or Hamburg or some state would like be like, hey, Facebook, we think you violated German data protection law. You got to pay 50,000 euros or whatever. And like that would happen a lot. And I just found that idea really enticing. And just the idea that like in Germany, people, readily accept kind of the fact that the government can regulate privacy in a way that we don't really do here in this country.
One of the things I really love about your work is sort of how international it is and how much time you've spent in other countries and thinking about how people in those other countries view privacy in different ways. And I'm curious to sort of ask for a little more around the European perspective in particular, partly just because already that regulatory environment has shifted a lot since when you were there, sort of looking at the Street View case. And I'm curious whether you think that sort of things like the European General Data Protection Regulation, which was in part about ramping up those fines so that when the DPAs did go in and say, Facebook, you broke the law, they could potentially at least demand a lot more money. Do you look at sort of I guess it's almost 3 years now, no, more than 3 years, almost 4 years of the GDPR going into effect. And do you feel that that's sort of making a positive difference in Europe, in the larger world? How do you see kind of the impacts of that European perspective playing out?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's really interesting. GDPR, as you said, which is I can never remember what that stands for. It's like the General Data Protection Regulation. There you go. It's such a mouthful. So GDPR exists. And I'm sure we've all seen these websites. From where I sit, it seems like to me the only kind of practical purpose, which is something that's like a positive step, is right. We encounter occasionally these websites that say like, do you accept these performance cookies or whatever? And you reject or you accept, or you say like, I just want to read the stupid article, like whatever. So I think there's that. As far as I know, you're right. Like, so GDPR, one of the things that it does is it imposes the potential of, I think it's a couple of percent of worldwide global revenue. As far as I know, that has not yet been imposed by any enforcement agency in Europe, but that is looming and is out there as a potential violation. Because you're right, what I sort of came to understand is that these paltry kind of 50,000 euros here, 100,000 euros there, whatever, I'm sure that is like Mark Zuckerberg's lunch budget. Like, that's nothing, like, to a company as large as Facebook or Google. I guess they're called Meta now, but whatever, right? These giant, American companies typically that they would face. GDPR. So the short answer is, I think that it's generally good that there are privacy regulations like GDPR. And here in California, we have something called the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, which among other things, allows individuals to request data held by private companies to sort of inspect it. It's not a perfect analogy, but somewhat similar to how you can do this under Public Records Act laws. But you can use CCPA to find out, what Facebook knows about you, what other companies know about you, and I think that's really good. So yeah, I think it's a positive step in the right direction. I don't know. I personally have not seen any sort of like meaningfully overt difference in how Facebook does business or how Google does business or how any of these companies do business. I think they're doing their best to kind of comply with the law. I'd like to believe that, but we have not yet seen sort of like any of these companies have to pay sort of a real penalty for violating the law, as far as I know.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the CCPA because Massachusetts, where Tufts is, where I am right now, began sort of debating a bill that's focused on internet privacy rights this month. It includes sort of some things that are pretty similar to CCPA provisions, like easy to understand disclosures, much more regulation for sensitive and biometric data, allowing people to opt out of having their data bought and sold. And I think sort of one of the things on my mind as we start going through this process here is, what do you think is the potential for states to regulate this in a meaningful way? Kind of, especially if the federal government is not willing to take up data privacy at the time, is it helpful to have individual states kind of doing this kind of regulation? What can they and can't they do well?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think that states, you're right. Since I've been writing about this, I don't think that there's been any real comprehensive or meaningful like privacy regulation, or whether to regulate private companies or whether to regulate the government's own behavior, right? So the book that I wrote, Habeas Data, is about 50 years of surveillance law in America. So it's focused specifically on what the government does to citizens, and that it's less focused on kind of what Facebook does to all of us, But you're right. I think that states like California, states like Massachusetts. You mentioned, right, biometrics, right? Illinois has a famous biometric law, as I'm sure you know. And I think it's really important for, cities and counties and states to, take the power that they do have as a way to properly and start to think about how we want companies to behave, how we want the government to behave, what kinds of technologies are allowed under what circumstances. And certainly those can change over time. But, I think what my reporting has shown is that oftentimes, I would say, especially of the capabilities of the government, and the government can mean, right, the city of Boston, but it can also mean the FBI or the NSA or some big scary three-letter agency like that, and everything in between, right? It can mean like your county sheriff, it can mean your state, law enforcement agency, whatever. But what seems to have often happened, I would say, especially over the last decade or more, is that government agencies will acquire technology, some kind of surveillance technology, and that could be, a license plate reader, that could be some kind of DNA scanning device, that could be a drone, that could be some sort of facial recognition device, that could be like, there's any number of things that are out there, and there are things that are kind of in development that are getting better all the time, right? Facial recognition 10 years ago was considerably less sophisticated than it is now. And I'm sure it will only get more sophisticated in the future. So I think that one of the things that these regulations, like you were talking about, can do is hopefully, I think, kind of put the brakes a little bit on it and make us all in and out of government, make us all a little bit more aware of how they're used and why they're used and what they're used for, and to make sure that they're not abused. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you brought up your book, Habeas Data, which is another great favorite of mine. And what I love about Habeas Data is that it's really sort of a history book. It's really sort of trying to understand the state of digital privacy through the lens of this set of historical cases. And it's, it's one of the things that I care about a lot in teaching privacy. Pavel, who's taking my privacy class right now, knows that I do a lot of, 100 years of pre-internet history almost, just to sort of set out the legal foundations. And so I'm really glad you wrote that book. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about sort of some of the historical legal decisions that you've looked at that have really shaped the ways, especially in the United States, that privacy is not protected? And is there sort of a particularly pivotal moment or case that stands out to you?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so you're right. So yeah, my book, Habeas Data, covers 50 years of surveillance law in America. And that 50 years is a nice, big, convenient round number, but it actually also makes sense, in this context. So the 50-year period covers 1967 to 2017. And the reason why I picked that window was because 1967, as you know, and as maybe some folks listening may know, there was this case called Katz versus United States, which is a case that involves, of all things, a sports betting and a phone booth on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood, California, not too far away from where I grew up in Santa Monica, California. This is the case that gives us the phrase reasonable expectation of privacy, right? Many people, I think, have heard that phrase, or maybe have seen it in news articles, or hear lawyers, deploy it all the time. But I think relatively few of us know like what that phrase means and how that phrase sort of came to be, and what the case was about that gave birth to that phrase. So what does a reasonable expectation? What does a reasonable expectation of privacy mean? In the context of that case, what it meant is that this guy Charles Katz, he was a guy who liked to make sports bets. He liked to go to a particular bank of phone booths across the street from the Chateau Marmont Hotel in Hollywood. The phone booths are no longer standing, but the hotel is. So next time you're staying at the Chateau Marmont, you can imagine a bank of phone booths across the street. He would walk not too long of a distance, a few minutes away from his residence to go make these phone calls, to make these sports bets on college basketball and some other things. And this was a time in the 1960s in Los Angeles where the Los Angeles police and the FBI as well was very interested in cracking down on sort of vice crimes, gambling and the like. And basically what they decided to do was they thought, okay, well, we know that this guy is making all these bets. He's spending a lot of money. Gambling is of course illegal. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a recording device on top of the phone booth in which Charles Katz used. And this is really interesting because they didn't do a wiretap. Wiretaps they did exist at the time, but there wasn't, I don't know how often they were used, but I don't know. It seems to me like the authorities here made a very deliberate choice to not get involved in the physical wires of the phone booth. So they decided to put some sort of recording device, which in my mind I sort of imagine as being something akin to like one of those like giant reels, like those old film projectors. I imagine it was something like that, right? This is 1960s technology we're talking about. So in the court, and this is borne out in the court documents, kind of amazing. They put this recording device on the roof of the phone booth, and they had people like run over. They would see him coming from like down the block. So they would send an agent to, I guess, climb up the phone booth and then like press record on the device and then run away so that Charles Katz would not see them. And so somehow they did this, and they took great care to only record him. They didn't record other people. So that's good from a privacy perspective. But they captured him on tape, making his bets. They busted him at the phone booth. I talked to one of the cops, former agents who was present for the arrest. They described him as being very polite. He followed authorities' instructions. He didn't resist. He's very well dressed. He liked to wear suits apparently. And they took him back to his place, to his apartment. They found all of his betting materials. They found quarters and all kinds of other things. Anyway, he was charged with illegal gambling. His lawyers challenged the case, and eventually the case gets all the way to the Supreme Court. And the question really is, did Katz have a reasonable expectation of privacy in a phone booth, like he would if he was at home, like he would if he was in his office or in a hotel room or a taxi or something like that? And ultimately, the Supreme Court said yes, that if the government wants to surveil somebody, if they want to deploy this type of listening equipment, they need a warrant to do that, right? So the court said, yeah, go get a warrant, and then it's fine. But what's interesting is that standard, and that's sort of why I kind of started the book with this case in particular, is that a lot of these cases sort of build on one another, or you can think of them, if you want to use a different metaphor, they're kind of it's kind of the family tree of surveillance cases, right? So if that's kind of one of the earlier ones, the kind of progeny of the Katz case is the cases that are much more recent. right, I talked about like asking myself the question, why is this legal? A technology that I've been kind of obsessed with for some time is license plate readers. These are, if you're not familiar, these are these specialized cameras. They're typically about, I don't know, yay big. They often sit on top of police cars. I'm sure you have them in Boston or wherever you live. They're very common in the US nowadays. And what they do is they capture license plates at high speed, up to 60 plates per second, which is kind of insane. We have them here in Oakland. They're very common. And when I first started reporting on license plate readers, it struck me like, why is this technology legal? How could this be allowed? And the answer is because of a different case that's also in the book, where the Supreme Court basically found that there is no reasonable expectation of privacy in public. So whatever you do out in public, drive your car, show your face, whatever you do out in the world, as far as the Supreme Court is concerned, that's fair game for surveillance, right? So you can drive your car down the street, even though, right, license plate readers didn't exist in 1982, when that other case that I'm talking about that said you had no reasonable expectation of privacy in public, when that was decided, that was the year go away. That technology didn't exist when that case was decided, the year I was born, 1982. And it surely didn't exist in 1967 when Katz was decided. And yet we're now still living with the ramifications of that. So like today, right, like literally right before I got on this call, I was reading an article in Gizmodo, and the headline is, "What to do if a cop tries to scan your face during a traffic stop." That's the world that we live in right now today. And right, we now live in a world where facial scanning is a real thing, is a very real thing. And if the Supreme Court says you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy in public, then practically what that means is, hey, the police can scan your face, right? Most of us, okay, it's pandemic now, right? Most of us, aren't typically, when it's not pandemic, wearing masks. Hopefully we won't be wearing masks forever. But I think that's very concerning. And to go back to your earlier point about, what can states do? I think states can maybe stay attuned to that and maybe think about that and regulate that in ways that they deem appropriate.
So I want to shift gears a little. I could talk to you about privacy the whole time, but you've also done a lot of really interesting work sort of in the past year or two looking at Amazon, which Pavel mentioned in the introduction, which you won the James Madison Freedom of Information Award for. So congratulations. And I have lots of questions about that. Partly I'm interested in sort of how you journeyed from privacy and surveillance to looking at the COVID outbreaks among Amazon workers, thinking about sort of the worker policy within the company. And was that about having contacts already at these places because you've been working on tech? Was that about sort of following tech companies more broadly? And I'm also sort of curious to hear a little bit about what you think of the various announcements Amazon has made about sort of changes and improvements to their processes and procedures. Do you think that there's actually progress being made there? Do you think that sort of the company is moving in a good direction, or do you think that is sort of mostly PR response?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question, or a big set of questions. But yeah, I mean, I think that, reporting on Amazon is one of those things that it's almost, in a way, it's like I'm a big Star Trek fan, so it's almost like the kind of like black hole. It's where everything kind of comes together. Amazon is this giant kind of nebulous company that I think affects all of us in ways that we may not realize, even if, many of us, I am an Amazon consumer. I buy stuff on Amazon, a decent amount. Sometimes I don't, I really wish I could go buy the specific bike part that I need from my local bike shop, but hey, I've called 4 bike shops and they don't have it, but I can buy it on Amazon and have it at my house in 2 days. So, there's ups and downs there. But with regard to, but it's also a place that, is much of the backbone of the internet these days. People I'm sure are familiar with AWS, Amazon Web Services. That is the literal almost lifeblood of many internet services that we use. I would not be surprised if this service that we're talking to each other on right now, Zoom, uses Amazon Web Services as its kind of main platform. So there's that. Then, right, you were talking about the story that we did about Amazon and COVID response and labor. Amazon, of course, is famous for using its own, type of surveillance or type of monitoring to make sure that its workers are in their their warehouses, their fulfillment centers, to make sure that they are doing what Amazon wants them to do at the speed that Amazon wants them to do it. There's a phrase that maybe you've heard that's called time off task, which is the phrase, or TOT as it's known within Amazon, where workers are sort of, admonished or dinged for, not doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? And these are people who are, receiving packages, shipping packages, sorting things, they're doing lots of things. But many people, I think, feel very frustrated that Amazon is sort of bearing down on them using monitoring systems like this. This is one of the reasons why there has been some efforts to unionize within Amazon. People may be familiar that that actually right now there's upcoming a revote in the union efforts in Bessemer, Alabama. There's been some discussions as well in Amazon facilities in New York, and maybe there are others afoot as well. But it's very clear to me that Amazon itself, Amazon workers, care a lot about kind of their own privacy and being able to do the work that they signed up to do. But Amazon is a big company. It's a profit-driven company. It's a publicly traded company, and they are growing like crazy. They are, I think, one of, if not the biggest employer in America right now. And it's hard to understate how much impact Amazon has had on America as a whole. And talking to many of these workers, it's really heartbreaking sometimes to hear from people who say that they feel like that they can't miss work if they're sick, or they can't take a break, they can't go use the bathroom, they can't they don't have adequate protection during the pandemic, and things of that nature. Amazon is a company that I think is really, deserving of scrutiny. Is Amazon doing the right thing? I would like to believe that they are. I would like to believe that they are trying to keep their workers safe, that they're trying to, do the right thing. However, it is also true that Amazon has a lot of turnover. You've probably seen, advertisements. I know here in Oakland, I see on buses every day, Amazon ads for trying to recruit people to come to their facilities. They are building and expanding like crazy. And I know that people typically in those types of warehouse jobs often burn out, right? They leave after a year or two or three, and they typically don't stay for much longer than that. So I think, to me, that says something about the environment under which people are working.
I'm curious, when you think about sort of the set of really big tech companies headquartered out there. By out there, I guess I mean California and the West Coast more broadly, if we're talking about Amazon and Microsoft. How susceptible do you think they have been in the past couple of years to employee pressure, to sort of pressures either about worker conditions or about political positions or privacy or surveillance, right? I think this is one of the things that I really go back and forth on, right? You see sort of Google responding to employee pressure around some of its contracts with the Department of Defense, but it's never sort of totally clear to me how much influence those workers really had in that setting.
Yeah, I think it's hard to tell. You may be referring to some of there was a big protest at Google a couple of years ago that I attended. And there have been efforts to unionize within the tech community for the first time in new ways. I think that, and some of those have had kind of mixed success for unionization. But you're right. I think that it's hard to fight these large companies, and it's hard to fight companies that have seemingly unlimited financial resources to come after, whether it's union organizing or people that say they've been mistreated, or people who say that, right? I'm thinking of the case of Google, where there was a top executive who got sort of a golden parachute after being accused of sexual misconduct and other kind of misbehavior. And I think that there's certainly a volume in a way that I think was not present maybe 5 or 10 years ago. I think that there's certainly an awareness of, maybe some of the limits that workers have been able to bring to the fore in new ways. It's interesting, for example, people may have heard about or seen this new Showtime series called Super Pumped, which is about Uber, which is based on the really good book by Mike Isaac of the New York Times, which is about kind of the rise of Uber and the kind of like bro culture as kind of personified by Travis Kalanick, the former CEO and founder of Uber, who's been ousted from the company, right? And the new CEO, Dara Khosrowshahi, has tried to, I think, purge that kind of bro culture DNA from the company. And we'll see, we haven't heard, as far as I know, we haven't heard anything that has sort of risen to the level of some of the allegations that somebody like Susan Fowler raised a few years ago when she said that as an engineer, as a woman engineer at Uber, she was, propositioned, and didn't want that and was subject to all kinds of misbehavior and mistreatment by men within the company that in her view was kind of encouraged by that peer group. So again, I would like to believe that that things are getting better. And certainly in the case of Uber, I think that, it seems like they have. I'm not aware of any kind of scandals that have risen to that level in recent years. But, the fact of the matter is also that, to not to pick on Uber, but like, right, Uber has its own different problems because the vast majority of its workforce are non-unionized. And Uber has lobbied here in California and is lobbying right now in Massachusetts to kind of enshrine this so-called independent contractor model in state law. So we were talking about using state law to help privacy. If you're somebody who believes in kind of, labor rights and the ability of workers to get kind of a fair shake and to unionize, right? So like companies like Uber and Lyft right now are using that apparatus to their advantage. So.
Got it. All right. So we're going to go to questions from the audience in a minute. So if you've got any, feel free to start putting those in the Q&A tool or the chat. I want to ask you sort of, as we're wrapping up this part of the conversation, a question from the Tisch College, which is hosting this event and something that they think and talk about a lot there, which is what is something that we should all be doing in this moment? If you could tell everybody here, tell everybody in the world to do one thing, to take one action to help protect their right to privacy, what would it be right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it can feel really overwhelming. It feels overwhelming to me, and I do this for a living, of how to kind of protect one's privacy. How do we be mindful of that? I would say first think about, and this is again one of those kind of terms of art that I'm sure you're familiar with, but that maybe folks watching may be less familiar with, is what's often called threat modeling, right? So like what that really means in like plain English is, what are you afraid of, right? So, right, we all have locks on our doors because we are in some way afraid of a person who we don't want to come into our home or our apartment, right? I have blinds on my window right here because at times I don't want people to see through my window, right? We all have that. So if you're talking about like the digital kind of version of that, right? We have passwords on our email, we have passwords on our Twitter accounts or whatever else, right? So I would say take a moment and think about what you as an individual are concerned about. Are you concerned about like, the Boston Police Department knowing where you are at any given moment? Are you concerned about Facebook knowing where you are on the internet and what you're doing and who you're interacting with? If the answer is I'm worried about Facebook, then the answer might be don't use Facebook. And right, there's costs and benefits to that, right? The cost is maybe you miss out because like all of your family and friends and professional contacts are there, and you really like, we all like cute cat videos, and like, right, like that's very irresistible. So like that's the cost that you may pay, but the benefit may be for you, it may be, right, I know I'm deleting my account, I'm no longer associated with this company insofar as I'm able, right? So we all kind of have to make those kind of trade-offs, right? I always tell people, having like, if you're afraid of the government, whether that's, your city or the federal government or, whatever, it's really easy to be private. All you have to do is just take your phone, throw it in the ocean, and move to a cabin really far away in the woods and live there forever and never talk to anyone. right? I think for most of us, that's impractical, right? Like we can't do that. We love, human connection. We love moving around the world. So I think for most of us, that's not an option, right? So like, unless you want to live in a Faraday cage or live in a mountain by the woods, like we can't do that. So I would say, think about what you're worried about and think about what trade-offs you're willing to make. And because privacy, honestly, is hard, right? It's really hard to like be perfectly private about everything all the time. And I think most of us make, whether we think about it or not, right? We make a decision to close our blinds, right? We make a decision to lock our doors. We make a decision to have a password on this account or that account. So that I would say would be one way. And another way would be if you're concerned about, right, like what surveillance technology does my town have, or what, go read or contact. I happen to know that the ACLU of Massachusetts is very active in this field. They know a lot. Go ask them if you live in Massachusetts. But also, right, like one of the things that I think is really cool and a tool that I use a lot as a journalist and that anyone can use, lawyers, like you don't need to be a lawyer, journalist, or have any kind of special credential, is file a public records request. And that could be with any public agency that you can think of. That could be with the MTA or the MBTA, or I think is what you guys call it over there. Whether that's the Mass State Police, whether that's the, Cambridge City Police, whether that's, like literally any public agency that you can think of, you as an individual, and you don't even need to be an American citizen to do this, you can literally just like send an email or fill out a form or send them a letter or fax if you really want to, communicate with them. Every agency has a slightly different process, but you can find out, like, you could ask them, how many drones does the Cambridge Police Department have? How many body cameras does the Boston Police Department have? Show me the contracts that you've used to purchase these things, right? That's a thing that you could get, right? If you wanted to know that. The ACLU might have beat you to it, but you could do it, right? So I would say those kind of two things is like thinking about like, what kind of privacy is important to you, what measures you're willing to take, and then, using the tools that we have, which are, often public records requests.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for that. I'm going to take some questions from the audience now. Adam Gismondi is curious whether in the wake of the Gawker lawsuit that was brought by Hulk Hogan and funded by Peter Thiel, you've seen any kind of chilling effect on critical coverage of Silicon Valley and the tech industry.
It's interesting. I would maybe argue, I haven't seen a chilling effect. I would say I've maybe even seen the opposite, like that it's been more kind of critical. That, there are, I think, more now that's certainly right. So that lawsuit, for folks who maybe are not familiar, the very short version is that Peter Thiel, who's a very well-known conservative and libertarian venture capitalist here in California, he has funded, among other things, a company called Palantir, which is a well-known kind of surveillance tech defense contractor type of company. And then the spin-off company from that, which is called Anduril, which he's also funded. Gawker used to run a website called Valleywag, which was a sort of gossip Silicon Valley type of a website. And at one point, Valleywag essentially outed Peter Thiel as being gay and said something to the effect of like, everyone knows that Peter Thiel's gay or whatever. Like it wasn't, I don't think, derogatory or anything. It was just kind of a matter of fact. And Peter Thiel didn't like that and kind of, carried that grievance with him for a long time. And yes, as this person says, ended up funding a lawsuit that ultimately, funding Hulk Hogan of all people to sue and ultimately shutter Gawker, which was the parent company of Valleywag, and that eventually brought Gawker to sort of an end. And a lot of people in journalism and maybe outside journalism too were very concerned that that this could have, as this person I think says, a chilling effect on media in general. That if a rich venture capitalist can sort of almost sue out of existence a media company, then that's not great. So yeah, I would say that there has been a lot of more critical coverage of tech companies in ways that I have not seen in recent years. I think the fact that, when I was at NBC, I was part of a new kind of investigatory tech team that didn't exist, 5 years ago. there's been other really good coverage from both kind of traditional tech media outlets. I'm thinking of, right, I mentioned Gizmodo a moment ago, other websites like The Verge, the website I used to work for called Ars Technica, but even, bigger, more mainstream publications, Forbes, like the New York Times, the Washington Post. You've seen, I think, a lot of really good journalism, right? There's no shortage of things to investigate, certainly. So yeah, that's, I don't know, that's how I see it.
Interesting, thank you. We have a question from Ross Blair about facial recognition technology, which we haven't really talked about at all today. Wants to know, in sort of the US versus other parts of the world, where do the big tech companies stand in terms of whether they're supporting facial recognition technologies? Mentions that IBM dropped support, that Google maybe did something similar, and curious sort of what that looks like in different countries around the world with those companies.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I have not, I'll be honest, I have not followed what exactly IBM or Amazon or other companies have done with regard to facial recognition abroad. But I think what this person is maybe referring to with regard to Amazon is, yes, that in the summer of 2020, Amazon was scrutinized for its use of facial recognition technology, and ultimately decided to, last year in May 2021, decided to extend their sort of moratorium on face recognition for police. And it's interesting because people may remember Amazon owns, among other things, they own this company called Ring, which incidentally was founded in my hometown, Santa Monica, California. Ring, of course, makes those little video doorbell cameras. I've written about them for NBC. The very short version is I'm not convinced that they actually do anything for law enforcement purposes. That's a different story. But I did obtain, through a public records request, thank you, Florida, I did obtain a video, like a promo video, that was sent to a police department in Florida that talked about how this is a feature that Amazon would like to expand, to use facial recognition as part of this Ring video camera system. And it's, again, I think understandable why they would want to do that, right? Amazon certainly has the capability of doing that, and they're selling this product to people with the belief that they think that it's going to stop, property crime and stop nefarious actors from doing things, at their home, at their front door, at their literal front door. But it seems to me that facial recognition, while there may have been kind of a slowing down of press coverage of what companies are doing, I have not seen any companies saying like, we're not going to do anything on this, or we're not, like, we're going to stop this, we think we should ban it, et cetera, et cetera. Right? Facial recognition is a tool that exists. And I think that, I think that, to go back to our earlier point about, proper regulation, I think that there are ways where cities, I know here in San Francisco, for example, has banned the use of facial recognition by police. I just saw very recently the city of New Orleans had banned the use of facial recognition by police, but now wants to overturn that in the name of public safety. So these things sort of come and go. I don't know, the person I think is asking about, here in the US versus Europe, China and Russia. I don't know as much about China and Russia, to be quite honest, but I think that, the short version is this technology is not going anywhere anytime soon. It's getting even more sophisticated. And, I would encourage you to follow it. I will continue to follow it as well.
We have a question from Chelsea Quilling, who wants to know if you have thoughts or opinions about what a federal privacy law should include. Ooh. And also what would be politically feasible, sort of possibly somewhere short of what you
right. Yeah, that's an interesting question, right? So yeah, what a privacy law would include. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think one of the things that I would like to see is, I would say at minimum, I would like to see a version of the CCPA, translated into federal law. Like, I think the idea of going to a company and saying, hey, show me what you know about me and delete what you know about me, I think is potentially a powerful tool. I would also like to see an agency. It could be the FTC. It could be an entirely new agency that would be created. The FTC is probably the best vehicle for this at this point. to have some real teeth in terms of going after companies and issuing financial sanctions or other kinds of penalties against companies that don't obey, right? Facebook has been under what are called consent decrees. These are basically agreements between the FTC and Facebook. Sometimes they will last 10 or 20 years, but Facebook, in that time has gotten bigger, right? All of these companies have continued to grow and continue to get bigger. And under the Biden administration, the FTC, I think, is looking at the largesse of big tech in an entirely new way. So I think that at minimum, I would like to see some of those things. I would like to also see, not to spoil the ending of my own book, but in my book, I talk about how one of the things that we do here in Oakland is we have a local privacy commission where when a city agency wants to acquire any kind of surveillance technology or technology that impinges on privacy in any way, that could be license plate readers, but it could also be video cameras that are meant to catch people who are dumping couches by the side of the road, so-called illegal dumping, even something as kind of relatively benign as that. That agency has to come before the commission and make an affirmative case for why they need that thing, why they need this tool. And they have to come up with an agreement with the commission saying like, okay, here's the tool we want, here's why we want it, here's what it's for, here's what it's not for, here's who can access it. And they kind of affirmatively and proactively come up with a set of standards and agreements and guidances and potential sanctions if that technology is misused ahead of time, right? Before the city has acquired that thing. So I would love to see a version of, this is what this shirt refers to as Hella Privacy. Hella, for those of you who don't know, is the Oakland or Northern California equivalent of, I think you say Wicked over there. So wherever you say Wicked, just replace that with Hella, you'll fit right in. So I would love to see a version of that in the federal law. Is that likely? It doesn't seem like it. I hate to say, but what would be more feasible, right? I think that I think something more feasible might be something that it's maybe possible to get something closer to like the CCPA at a federal level. I don't know. I don't know. It's really hard because we have, right? We are, as everyone I think knows, right? Like the powers that be in the White House and Congress change a lot, and it doesn't seem to me that both sides. There's not. I haven't seen a ton of agreement in like mainstream conservatives and mainstream liberals agreeing on that. I think that sometimes you'll see it maybe on the farther sides of the spectrum, like libertarians like care a lot about privacy, and like I think maybe a little bit more folks on the left care about it. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like that's not a great answer, but I try to be optimistic that the lessons from California and Massachusetts will be heeded in Washington.
So we have another question from Michael Ambrosino, who's interested in what are the most constructive ways that you've seen users organize to push back against tech giants? And are there educational campaigns that you think have sort of worked really well to empower and educate users in this space?
Yeah, I mean, so I mentioned, right, the ACLU of Massachusetts specifically, right, there are a number of kind of activist groups that I think really have built a whole body of work around thinking about these types of issues. Another one is right here in California that folks may be familiar with, called the Electronic Frontier Foundation. You can go to EFF.org and learn more about what they do. But I would say those groups oftentimes are doing their own type of activism, right? They have teams of lawyers, they have teams of researchers, analysts, other kinds of folks that work with to better understand what various companies and agencies are doing. Right, I mentioned this Amazon facial recognition thing. A lot of that pushback initially came from research that was done by the ACLU and using records requests to figure out kind of what that system sort of looked like. And they ended up doing this very public and I thought very effective test where they ran Amazon's so-called recognition with a K facial recognition system against photos of members of Congress, and they were falsely flagged as being potentially, I think, criminals. I think maybe John Lewis was among them then Congressman John Lewis. But and it disproportionately affected people of color, and it didn't have a great outcome. But I think that those are groups that I think have really tried for quite some time to push back against many of these companies. And so if that's something that you are animated by, I would encourage you to there was a link to the ACLU Massachusetts in the chat. There's a lot of groups like that that are very kind of active in this area.
Then we have a question from Dane Shapiro about cookies and third-party trackers.
Yeah.
Saying, looking at the browser they see, there's a ton of sort of different things tracking them across the internet. How worried should a person be about that? Is it sort of just marketing, or is it a big problem? What should we be doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, tracking online has gotten really sophisticated, right? I think that, again, if you don't care that Facebook or other companies online that are maybe following your movements online, if you don't care, if you don't care that somebody knows that you're a Patriots fan and a Democrat and I don't know, you love to eat tacos or whatever, then maybe that's fine, right? Like, then maybe, again, right, think about what we were talking about earlier with regard to the threat modeling, right? Like, what is sensitive information about you that maybe you do or don't care that companies know? You may care less about your favorite sports team. You may care more about your religious preference. You may care more about if you are I think all of us, and this is a point I make in the book, right? All of us, I think, engage in activity, in perfectly legal activity that we may not want to be sort of a permanent record of. And that could range from, religious activity, that could range from medical activity, that could range from, maybe you decided to go to a sex shop or a gun store or a strip club, or here in California, and I think Massachusetts too, a cannabis dispensary, right? You may or may not want, those are all like legal activities, but you may not want there to be a record of the fact that you have engaged or tried to engage with those services online or in the real world. So you may, so if that bothers you with regard to the cookie question, there are lots of sort of anti-tracking tools that you can download. There's one called Ghostery. There's one called AdBlock Plus. There's a bazillion of them. There's more privacy-minded search engines. There's one that has a very cute name, which is called DuckDuckGo, which has a very cute little logo of a duck wearing a bow tie. DuckDuckGo is powered by Microsoft Bing, so that may or may not bother you. But if you want an alternative to Google, that's like a pretty decent one. And DuckDuckGo sort of markets itself as a privacy-focused company. But again, right, there are trade-offs, right? If you decide you want to extricate yourself from the Google universe, you may have to engage with other kinds of services. So I would say if you're worried about cookies specifically, or you're worried about like information that you gather that is gathered about you online, I would try to make use of the many tools that exist to try to mitigate that as much as possible.
So we're going to have to wrap up in a couple minutes. I'm going to give one last question from Susan James, who's interested in why our default is that you have to opt out of data collection, right? In each individual category, I have to check a box and please don't collect this, instead of actively needing to opt in.
I think that's a really, really great question. And I don't have a good answer. I wish I did. But I think that that's something that has sort of been ingrained into all of us, I think, who have kind of come up with various online services, is that we've just allowed that to be the default, right? I think that companies and governments and surveillance technologies are constantly trying to kind of push the limit ever closer until somebody tells them to sort of pull back a little bit. So, I wish, I think as this person seems to, I wish that all of it was opt-in, right? Like every time I'm asked to opt out of like, no, I don't want to be on this email list. No, I don't want you to collect my like performance enhancing cookies or whatever. Like, I don't want any of that. But sadly, that's the world that we live in. I hate to say it. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This has been so fascinating. I'm really grateful to you for joining us all here today. I'm really grateful to all of you in the audience who took the time to come and listen and ask questions, and also to Tisch College and the Cybersecurity and Public Policy Program for sponsoring this event today. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and thanks again.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you to Tufts. Thank you to everybody who made this happen. Thanks to the folks for watching at home. I tweet way too much at C Farvar. You can find me on Twitter there. I didn't get to all the questions, so feel free to ask me questions in Twitter. I'm very easy to reach on the internet. My email address is everywhere. But reach out to me, say hi. I'm a nice person. We can talk about Star Trek all day and public records requests all day. But yeah, anyway, thank you, and all the best to all of you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.